Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this special Earth Day webinar about electric vehicles and emissions here in New England. My name is Mal Skoron. I'm a program associate for Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and I'm joined by my colleague Jaima Braga, who is our renewable energy procurement director, and I'm really excited to get started. Thanks again for joining this special Earth Day webinar. I hope you all were able to enjoy the sunny but chilly weather today. Before we get started, I'd love to go through a couple of logistics. So first, everyone is muted to avoid background noise, but we do want to make this webinar as interactive as possible and leave lots of space for your questions. So feel free to send your questions as they occur to you in the Q&A box that you should see in the GoToWebinar panel, and we'll be sure to address any questions that you have at the end. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the slides as well as the recording by email after the webinar, as well as any resources that we mention here tonight, so that you're able to fully engage with the material that we present with you today. Green Energy Consumers Alliance is a nonprofit organization based in Providence and Boston. Our mission is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. And we do that in a couple of ways. First, by offering clean energy programs that make things like renewable energy and electric vehicles more accessible to consumers in the two states that we work in. And we also use our experience running those programs in order to help shape and inform our policy priorities in order to make sure that we are able to develop policy that can help advance our mission as well. So during this webinar, you'll see a little bit of both and how those two things interact in order to help achieve our mission. And again, my name is Mal Skoron. I'm the Drive Green Program Associate, and so most of my work is in the Drive Green program that helps educate and create access for electric vehicles. And my colleague Jaima is our Renewable Energy Program Director, or Procurement Director, and you'll hear a little bit more about her work later in this webinar. But with that, let's get started. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about the emissions of the average gas-powered car in New England. That emits about 381 grams of climate warming gas per mile. You can think of that as a carbon dioxide type of gas. And to put that into context, that is a lot. Transportation is currently the largest contributor to climate change in Massachusetts and Rhode Island as well. And so we really need to be able to create alternatives to the gas-powered car in order to meet our mandatory climate goals in Massachusetts and Rhode Island as well. The good news is that electric cars are much cleaner than gas-powered cars when it comes to climate warming emissions, as well as the emissions that degrade local air quality. On the current electricity system that we have, they emit just 96 grams of climate warming gas per mile driven. So by switching to an electric car from a gas-powered car, every mile that you drive reduces per mile carbon pollution by 74%. Now, that's a really, really large number, considering that for the last couple of years, our transportation emissions here in New England have only grown. So electric vehicles are a huge opportunity in order to address the climate crisis and make sure that we have clean alternatives here in New England. Now, you may be wondering, why are electric cars so much better? How is this possible? You might think that there's a lot of natural gas and coal on the grid that makes it dirty. You might be confused about other things that you might have heard about electric vehicles. And so we're here to set the record straight and really emphasize exactly why electric cars are so much better. And the first reason that they're much cleaner and better for the climate is a reason that's often understated or ignored by lots of folks. The reason is that electric cars are more efficient. So they use less energy to travel more miles. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So if you take the energy contained in a gallon of gasoline, that's what makes your car move, is that ingrained chemical energy in that gasoline. If you were to put a number on it, in terms of a unit you might be familiar with, a gallon of gasoline contains about 33.7 kilowatt hours, which is the unit that you use to pay your electricity bill. You pay a certain number of cents per kilowatt hour. So if you could completely turn the energy in a gallon of gasoline into electricity, to give you a sense of reference, that's about 4 times what I use in a month. I just looked at my utility bill this morning. And so I could totally power my electricity needs in the energy of 4 gallons of gasoline. The problem is that you can't directly take all of that energy contained in gasoline and translate it into useful work or energy because combustion engines are really inefficient. When you put gasoline into an engine and burn it to be able to use it as a fuel, you lose a lot of the energy in that gasoline as waste heat, which means that if you're driving a regular gas car that gets 30 miles to the gallon, then a single gallon of gasoline will take you just 30 miles. If you drive a hybrid vehicle, so that's a car with a combustion engine and a battery, but no plug, you increase your efficiency quite a bit because the car is able to take the energy that is usually lost as waste heat and store it in a battery so that you can use it and increase the number of miles that you get from that gallon of gasoline. So that improves efficiency quite a bit. But then if you look at an electric car, which has no combustion engine, doesn't run on gasoline, and is charged by a regular outlet or a charging station, you can get much more miles in using an electric car than any of the other alternatives. And so that is basically has to do with the fact that electric induction motors are more efficient and they can convert about 90% of the energy that's put into them to actual work. So that's a large part of the reason that electric cars emit less pollution. But the second reason, the big reason that we're here to mostly talk about today is that electricity mostly comes from clean, zero-emission resources, and it's more than you might think. I apologize if you can hear the dog drinking in the background. We got a visitor here. So now I'll pass it off to my colleague Jaima to talk a little bit more about what that means.
Okay, thank you, Mel. So as you can see here on your screens, every utility has to provide electricity from renewable sources. So they also have to disclose where the electricity comes from on a regular basis. Usually for Massachusetts and Rhode Island utilities, it's every 6 months that utilities have to disclose this to the public. So here on your screen, you can see what a disclosure label looks like for National Grid, explaining where the electricity is coming from. Eversource also has a very, very similar disclosure label. So just for our reference here, we're just going to use the National Grid one, but again, it's very similar. So you can see that highlighted here in green are the fossil fuels where we get our power from. So you have coal and natural gas and oil, right? The usual suspects, and we have them about 40% based on the disclosure label. But then if we look at zero emission resources, which include hydro, imported power, nuclear, solar, and wind, we're actually at 55% zero emitting resources, and that is pretty remarkable. And the reason why we say that for imported power that is included in the zero emitted resources is because most of that power does come from Canada and the source of hydropower. There's some other that might be also trickling in, but the vast majority is going to come from Canada and the source of hydropower. So we will also point out that there's some of these resources that are considered as renewable by the state, but they actually do emit some greenhouse gas emissions, and that's maybe your biomass, your trash, or other types of renewables, but that only accounts for a very small percentage of the electricity, and according to this disclosure label, it's going to be about 5%. So as I mentioned, that's over half of our power is coming through non-emitting resources already. So this is one of the biggest contributors why electric vehicles are just much more cleaner than gasoline-powered cars, since we have less emissions overall. So I'll pass it back on to you, Mal.
I'll jump back in again. Thanks, Jaima. Thanks. Even if federal fuel economy standards improve significantly, the gas-powered cars put on the road today won't get any better. So what that means is that if I go out and buy a gas-powered car tomorrow and it gets 30 miles to the gallon, then in 10 years, it's still going to be consuming 30 miles or 1 gallon for every 30 miles that I drive. It's just not going to get any better, even if in 5 years or 10 years, there is a slight technological improvement to make the cars slightly more efficient. So that means that we're kind of stuck with the emissions. We're locked into the emissions for every gas-powered car that's new that we put on the road. But electric cars have a different story.
Okay, so here we're going to talk about, there's two very important state laws in Massachusetts that promote the use of renewable energy, and that's going to be your renewable portfolio standard and the clean energy standard. They are both separate, but they have the same goal, is that we're trying to increase the percentage of renewable sources that are producing our electricity every year. So when we are replacing all these emitting resources by increasing the amount of renewable energy that's in the mix, from fossil fuel power plants to non-emitting resources like wind and solar, every time that we displace one of these fossil fuels and replace it with wind or solar, we get the grid cleaner and cleaner over time. So as these get replaced, right, we're going to see those emissions coming down over time.
And this is where the story really gets interesting for electric vehicles, because as I said, gas-powered cars are pretty consistent over time, but the electric cars that are put on the road today, or the ones that are already on the road, are going to decrease in their contribution to climate change as we clean up the grid, and of course, depending on which emitting resources are replaced first. So I should mention the trend line that you see there for electric cars. It looks like it's sloping gradually, but you see it decreases quite a bit. The scale, I think, will change in a couple of slides, so you can see that slope a little closer up to get a sense of how much it's changing. But the other thing to note about this change over time is that here it's illustrated linearly, as in, like, you know, we see a pretty consistent change. Really, what we can expect is more of a zigzag, depending on when large renewable energy projects come onto the grid, and also, you know, displacing a coal-fired power plant or an oil-fired power plant, for example, is more impactful than a natural gas one. So that'll be more of a zigzag, but this is a pretty good illustration of what we can expect, especially in the long run. And so I really just want to drive this point home because all of the cars that we are buying are locking us in for the next 11 years. On average, a gas car or any car at all is on the road for quite a long time. And so we have limited opportunities to be able to replace each and every new gas car with its electric equivalent. And this is absolutely vital to Massachusetts to be able to reach its climate goals, especially the ones that have been set by the most recent Next Generation Roadmap bill that was signed recently by Governor Baker. So again, those emissions from gas-powered cars are pretty consistent, whereas the electric car purchased, you know, today or tomorrow in 2021 emits 96 grams per mile today, And in 2030, that same car will release just 65 grams per mile. So that's a significant improvement, and it'll only get better. And so in this way, green energy consumers believe that we're on the road to a pathway that allows us to eliminate carbon pollution, and there's no reason to wait. So let's take a longer term look at what we might expect in the next couple of decades.
Great. So again, when we're talking about current state law in Massachusetts, right, we're talking about the Renewable Portfolio Standard and the Clean Energy Standard. So that's the slope there that you see for the current state law, and how this will then affect how clean electric cars can then have this trajectory through 2050. So right now we have a 3% more renewable energy increase per year until 2030, and that's thanks to the law that Mal just mentioned that the governor signed last month, which is a very good step forward. But unfortunately, after 2030, it defaults back to a 1% increase per year in renewable energy demand. So we really could do more. So we have in Massachusetts, the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. Basically, it's a plan that it's outlined how the Commonwealth is going to work through the next couple of years to make sure that it hits the 2030 emissions limit. So it's proposing to then increase the clean energy standard from its current state to 60% renewable by 2030. So seeing that if we do have a much more aggressive goal and progression towards renewable, you can see the new line is going to be that blue line, and how faster we can get to those lower grams of CO2 emissions from the electric vehicles. So if you look basically by the end of 2030, you have a very dramatic decrease in emissions compared to what we have today. And then also, of course, if you look towards the end of our goal, which is right now, it's at 2050, it's a big difference, and it will bring those emissions down to zero, right? Because our goal is to get to 100% renewables and 100% non-emitting resources by 2050. Yep, so in 2030, the EVs would emit just 11% of the average gas-powered car. But as Mal said, we can still do much better than we're doing with the current state law. So we definitely urge Massachusetts to follow Rhode Island. Rhode Island has a very aggressive and impressive goal of having 100% renewable energy by 2030. And they're doing this very well. They're procuring a lot of different renewable energy resources. They have a lot of offshore wind that they've procured, and they hope to have online within the next couple of years. They're going through solar and also looking at proper siting for all of these resources. So we applaud Rhode Island, and we hope that Massachusetts surely follows their steps. Mel, do you want to take over?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just unmuting myself. So yeah, if we are very aggressive with our clean energy policies, then all of the electric vehicles on the road today and every year from now until 2030 will be absolutely zero emissions. And then all of the vehicles after that will be zero emissions. So this is quite a big deal, considering that transportation, again, is our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And so you can see by pursuing electric vehicles aggressively along with these clean energy policies, then you kind of get a 2-for-1, right? Because power generation and transportation are our largest two emitters. And so pursuing all of these policies does a lot to make sure that we can reach our goals. And it's also worth mentioning that specifically in transportation, a lot of these advancements and possible projections for electric vehicles wouldn't be possible without the technological improvements that we've seen with lithium-ion batteries. And so we're kind of at a tipping point right now where we really can see electric vehicles taking off quickly. And we want to speed that up as much as possible so that we can follow the green trajectory for every car that's on the road, and to be able to advocate for that 100% by 2030 policy in Massachusetts, which is not a done deal in Rhode Island yet either, but it definitely helps us in both of those two sectors. And I think Jaima will take on the next slide, but I want to add that this is not, although 100% by 2030 is certainly an ambitious goal, it can be done because of the amount of renewable energy projects that are coming online in the next couple of years. So I'll let Jaima take it over from here.
Great. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of good projects, very exciting projects that are in the pipeline. So by 2024, we have about 20% of Massachusetts power will come from Canadian hydropower. And that's thanks to a law that passed a couple of years ago. So we're waiting on that. And then shortly thereafter, we got 40% of our power will come from Vineyard Wind and Mayflower Wind projects. So Massachusetts has already contracted with these two offshore wind developers to have electricity come from these offshore wind projects, and hopefully have them online by the mid-2020s. So that will also displace and generate a lot of electricity, and it will be very beneficial for ratepayers alike. And there's a lot of solar that's getting built in Massachusetts. The SMART program, which is the Solar Massachusetts Renewable Target, they have a lot of solar in the pipeline as well. They have a lot of incentives. So we believe that there is a lot of potential that in a lot of projects that are going to come into fruition by 2030. So that road that we've highlighted there in green, it is doable. And the benefits will be for all of the electric cars on the road, and obviously it's more. And we can get to it so much more faster than the current state law, which unfortunately does not get us to 100% renewables even by 2050. So we really do encourage that we need to reduce these emissions much more sooner. And one way to do that is by pursuing the reduction of emissions at the local level. So we have a lot of cities and towns in Massachusetts that are taking upon themselves to demand more renewable energy than required by the RPS and by the CES. And this we call, so we call this renewable green municipal aggregation. And what happens is that whole communities will come together and they will use their buying power, right, because you have a lot of consumers going together to going out to bid at the same time to get a more favorable rate for their supply. So they can then compete against what the local utilities are offering. So hopefully they can not just only pay less for their electricity, but also with their buying power, they can also ask for more renewable energy and have a really big impact on their demand. So therefore, their electricity that they're consuming overall is much more or less polluting than what we have with the utility. So how does it apply to electric vehicles? Well, we can see, again, the blue line where we're thinking that the 60% plan will get us to. But if we have a new community that is demanding 10% more or what's required by state law, then you can see that we get to the goals where we want to be much more faster. So any electric vehicle then will become 100% zero emissions 10 years sooner than the rest of the state. Because again, if you're doing a 10% increase, you're really 10 years ahead of state law once you get into that state where we're doing 1% increase of renewables per year. So that is very impressive. But what if you have a very aggressive community that is very interested in lowering their greenhouse gas emissions and having a good impact? Well, let's say that they want to go and accept 30% renewable than what's required. Well, then we get there much faster, right? We can see there on the graph that we get to in the late 2020s, we can get to 100% zero emissions before the end of the decade. So in the local level, by pursuing green municipal aggregation, we really can make an impact with our electric vehicles. So when we aggregate together what we have and we believe that is going with green municipal aggregation by the end of 2021, we believe that these communities will be responsible for increasing the demand of renewable energy by approximately 700,000 to 1 million megawatt hours per year. So putting the things into perspective, every household consumes about 7,000 kilowatt hours per year, right? So then if you put it in the same unit, in the lower range, we have 7 million, right? If we're talking about kilowatt hours per year. So the impact is really, really big on what we really can do with increasing the demand through green municipal aggregation and having that EV in a GMA community. So in another way to put it is that that's the equivalent of about 200 large-scale wind turbines. That's a lot of turbines, right? The biggest wind project that we have in Massachusetts right now, I believe it's in Western Massachusetts, and only has about 15 or 20 wind turbines. So that is a lot of renewable energy coming from non-emitting resources that will make a really big impact into our electricity consumption in driving our electric vehicles. All right, so I hope this sounds really good. So here's what we can do to make this all happen. So first, you can encourage your community to pursue green municipal aggregation. And if you are already doing green municipal aggregation, you can also opt up to support more renewables. So usually a green municipal aggregation program will have different options available to residents, where the default program has a set percentage of renewable energy above what's required by law. Nowadays, communities are starting as high as 10%, which is great. But all the programs are available where you can then opt up to even 50% or 65%, or even better yet, 100% renewable. And that will also then trickle down to your electric vehicle if you have one and you plug it into your community.
Which brings us to our second recommendation of something that you can do to make sure that we can reach this future is to make your next car electric. Whether you're planning on driving your current car until the next year or for the next 5 years, we at Green Energy Consumers like to say that your next car absolutely should be electric. There are more models coming out than ever before. You might have heard the recent news that General Motors will only sell electric vehicles starting in 2035. So we can expect a significant ramp up in the models that are available. I don't know if it's just me, but I've definitely noticed more advertising of all the electric vehicles that are available. And so consumer acceptance and awareness is really expanding. And you can use Green Energy Consumers Drive Green program to help you across every step of the process. So if you're not quite sure about the technology or whether it could work for you, we have plenty of resources to help you figure out charging, or answer any questions you might have about maintenance, compare different models so that you can get the best car for you in your budget, and generally just walk you through the process so that when you do decide to go electric, if you do, you can find a dealership where you'll have a good experience and also get a good price on your car. So we can help you out with all of that and more. And with that, I would love to bring it over to questions. And I'll just see which ones we have here. So I only see one question. So if you do have any clarifying questions or things that you'd like more information on, don't be shy about putting things into the chat. But I will start with this one question from Anne asking about electric vehicle affordability. Yeah, so I'm happy to take this one on as the Drive Green representative here. So this is definitely really important because for the last couple of years, I think there is a perception, particularly because of the success of Tesla, which makes luxury vehicles, that electric cars are really expensive and out of reach for most consumers. And that's changing really quickly. As I mentioned earlier, lithium-ion battery technology is improving fast, and that's the most expensive part of the electric car. Really, it makes up, I think, like a third of the entire cost of the vehicle. And with those prices going down, we expect that electric cars will be as inexpensive to buy as comparable gas-powered cars by 2025. So that's really, really soon. And good news for folks that are looking to buy new. If you're still if you're looking for a car in the near future, then the good news is that there are plenty of pre-owned vehicles available at good prices as well. So in particular, there are plenty of available vehicles that are off lease, so gently used from 2017 in the last couple of years, that can make owning an electric car much more accessible. But the thing to remember too is that electric cars have already been shown to be more cost effective on a lifetime basis. And so if you are concerned about that upfront cost, it might be worth kind of looking into what your ownership costs will look like, because that might make it more affordable for you. What that means is that you won't be paying as much in fuel, and you're also expected to pay less in maintenance and repairs as well. So taken all together, going electric can be much more affordable than you might think, and you don't have to get a Tesla. There are other options available. So check that out on our website if you haven't already. I have a question for you, Jaima, about solar. So one person has asked about large-scale solar and how that is being developed by clear-cutting forests. Could you talk a little bit about the trade-offs there and the green energy consumer's perspective on that?
Sure. Yeah, so right now in Massachusetts, thankfully, the SMART program that I mentioned, it's actually, I would say it's really smart, pun intended, because it has some incentives built into place where projects are actually developers are motivated to build in the right place. So if someone decides to build a large scale project in a greenfield, what we call, and if you have to cut down trees, they actually take away some of the profits from the program. Well, I would say they don't take it away. It's just the rate that they're going to get as a contract through their utility. It's going to be much lower than if they put it, let's say, on a rooftop or a brownfield or a carport, for example. So Massachusetts has been very progressive in that sense, but they can build it there. As the green energy consumers, we definitely stay away from projects that take down trees and are a little bit more harmful for the environment. And we tend to support projects that are good for the environment, that there's very little to no clear cutting. But also a lot of developers do take the extra step where they try to revitalize the areas where they are putting their solar projects in. So they will bring in some native plants and they will do some conservation efforts. So those are the projects that we're really looking for. In Rhode Island, there's no law like that or no policy in place that will lean towards one versus the other, but I know they're looking into it. So we're definitely a little bit more picky when picking the projects that we support. And we definitely are glad that Massachusetts has a policy in place that motivates people to stay away from clear cutting and develop the sites that are more intuitive or more conducive to solar. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Jaima. We have a question from Karen asking about what are the Massachusetts state and federal rebates available, and are they available if you buy or lease? Thank you for asking this question, because it just occurred to me I did not mention this when I was talking about the upfront cost of electric cars, because yes, there are incentives and they can make a significant impact on the affordability of these vehicles. So the federal incentive is structured as a tax credit. So when you go in and purchase or lease your purchase your car, you report it on your federal tax income filing, and then you get that money back as a credit, and it's up to $7,500 depending on the model of the vehicle that you get. If you lease, that incentive is typically rolled into the lease price. So you might not explicitly get that money or see that when the price is laid out, but that is typically rolled into that lease process. And you can compare those values on the Drive Green EV shopping portal and kind of see where that would stack up and see what is a better financial decision for you. And the Massachusetts state incentive is a cash incentive. And so how it works is you go in, you purchase your vehicle, or you lease it. The incentive is applicable if you do either one. And then you fill out an application, and within, I think, 60 days or 30 days, they'll send you a check for $2,500 if it's a battery electric vehicle, or $1,500 if it's a plug-in hybrid. And there are some additional restrictions as well. So the car has to be under a certain purchase price and some other things. You can read more about that on the More EV website, which is mor-ev.org, and it'll walk you through how to apply and go through that process. And all Massachusetts residents are eligible for that one. And that can significantly decrease the purchase price as well. And those are all rolled into the prices that we have on the Drive Green website. And it can vary significantly from the sticker that you see planted right on the car. As an anecdote, my parents recently bought a new Bolt because they got into a bit of a fender bender in an old car and decided it was time to let go of that one. And they were very surprised to see the $40,000 like price sticker at the dealership, and they had to go and talk to the salesperson. The guy was like, "Oh, I don't really know what this car's actual purchase price is." And he did some like beep boop on the computer and was like, "Oh yeah, actually this car is eligible for much less than what it's advertised for." So our Drive Green tool helps you kind of navigate all of that so that you can find the actual real price that you'll be paying and not just the MSRP, which is not the best indicator of purchase price. So thanks for that question. Great. So there are a couple more questions coming in about electric cars. Please send your grid questions over to Jaima as well. She is an under-tapped resource here and can answer all those questions. But I'll go on to the next one. James asks, is there a source you could recommend where I could read reviews of the top-rated electric cars for comparison? Yeah, there are a couple of good ones. I would say if you subscribe to the Drive Green newsletter, we have those kind of written out. We also have some blogs that kind of go through the different options for different vehicle classes. So most recently, we posted a blog about all the electric SUVs coming out so that you can comparison shop a little bit, see what people have to say. But I would say just go with the existing resources like Edmunds or Kelley Blue Book, things like that already provide reviews of cars, and they should have electric cars available as well. And they do a pretty good job about writing about things that are relevant if you're only looking at electric cars. And so, yeah, I would just recommend that. And there's one more question from Jack about the necessary infrastructure regarding charging stations. Yeah, so that is definitely a major area of investment that Massachusetts needs to support in the next couple of years. So right now, the majority of charging for existing EV drivers happens at home. Most people charge either using a regular household outlet, or they choose to upgrade to a 220 volt outlet, which is something that you would plug a dryer or a washer into. So it's just a slightly higher voltage to be able to support higher power so that you can charge your car faster. And that's how the majority of people do their charging, and it's really great and easy. But not everyone can do that. I'm a renter. I can't do that. If you live in a condo or a larger apartment building, it can be hard to do that as well. And also, we need to be able to install charging stations to support long distance trips. So all of those things are in progress in Massachusetts, thanks to the investments made by utility companies, actually. They're doing a good job of investing money to make sure that we have charging stations where we need them, specifically at workplaces and apartment buildings, and places where folks are parked for long enough where it makes sense to have a charging station. But we need more. And I'm hopeful that the Biden administration's proposed plans will help provide the funds to be able to do so, because that's good for electric cars and also good for creating clean energy jobs for electricians in state. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and a good amount of investment as well. But yeah, optimistic that that will take off in the coming years. Here's a question for you, Jaima. Thank you, submitter. How does a community go about actually proceeding with GMA?
Okay. Yes. Thank you for the question. So it will depend on the structure of your community on how things are passed. But basically, the issue needs to be raised either to town council or the board of selectmen. So whoever passes those policies within the community, and they have to pass the plan, right? They have to draft a plan saying that the community wants to pursue aggregation. So then that will pave the way for the community to look for an energy broker, which will then help the community decide or look for an electricity supplier that can provide a more competitive rate compared to basic service. And then at the end of the day, basically, hopefully you will go out and have a lot of bids from different suppliers, and the community will then choose a winner and sign a contract with one of the suppliers that can give them the option of having their own electricity, and hopefully it will have it with more renewable energy resources. So again, it has to start within the community itself and be raised within the town council or board of selectmen, and then have that plan approved. So if you want to have more information about this, we have the steps of how the plan works on our website. It's at greenenergyconsumers.org/aggregation. And if you have any questions in particular or need help organizing your community, feel free to send me an email. My email address is right on the screen, jaima@greenenergyconsumers.org.
Thanks, Jaima. Great. So I see one more question about the nature of emissions that we talked about. So in this webinar, we talked a lot about greenhouse gas emissions, which contribute to climate change. But there's a question about the other kinds of emissions that electric cars are responsible for. And this is actually really exciting because electric cars have no tailpipe, because there's no burning of anything in an electric car when it's going. So there's no noxious fumes or nitrogen oxides or particulates that need to be released from the vehicle. What that means is that electric cars are much better for local air quality. And so if you're if you live in an area that is particularly burdened by air pollution, the transition to electric vehicles will help to alleviate that problem. And then, there's also the issue of emissions that harm air quality coming from power plants. And as we replace those with renewable energy resources and zero emitting resources, then we'll be addressing those as well. So on both fronts, when we say zero emissions, it's good for the climate, but also good for public health and air quality as well. And so that is a particular area of concern for our advocacy at Green Energy Consumers, because electric vehicles aren't just passenger cars. They can be buses, they can be trucks, pickup trucks. All vehicles can be electrified in due time, and we're starting to see those models come out. So in the last year or so, we've really stepped up our advocacy game to support the MBTA in Massachusetts and RIPTA in Rhode Island to eliminate their diesel buses and replace them with electric versions. And that's really exciting too, because vehicles that run on diesel are the worst contributors to poor air quality. That has to do with the chemistry of diesel versus gasoline that I won't get into, but suffice it to say that areas that have a lot of buses tend to have worse air quality because of that. And so electrifying all of them will help a lot with that issue. And it's a big part of the reason we need the Transportation and Climate Initiative as well. It's TCI to help support the transition to those alternatives. So those are all of the questions that I see. So before we wrap up, get your questions in now if you have them. Jemma, do you have any final thoughts before we conclude a little bit early for this Earth Day webinar?
Sure. I'll just say that the path to 100% renewable, it can seem very complicated when you really look at the details. But again, when you look at the bigger picture and you kind of take a step back, it's pretty simple, right? We have to take these fossil fuels out of our grid and start transitioning and really support these large-scale renewable energy projects that are coming online. For example, those big offshore wind companies. Because as Mal mentioned, it's not only going to be cheaper for the ratepayer when it comes to electricity, but it's also going to be good for the environment, and it's also going to be good for our health. So it's just a good triple bottom line there that we have, and we definitely should look forward to it and should really work together to get towards that goal.
Yeah, I like the phrasing of triple bottom line. I haven't heard that before, and that's great. Awesome. Well, on that note, I think that's a great way to wrap up my Earth Day, at least. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope you have a good rest of your day and a good rest of your Earth Month as well. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions about electric vehicles or our work in the renewable energy space. So thanks again, and have a good rest of your night.
Thank you.